Now I'd like to talk about dealing with journalists. This comes from a lot of experience on my part. These are the things I wish I had known when I first started dealing with journalists. Let me tell you a story of my first interaction. I was a very young researcher newly appointed at the University of Melbourne, and I got rung up by a journalist from a newspaper. This was just before the comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 was going to hit Jupiter, and it was going to have a whole series of impacts and explosions, and astronomers around the world were very excited and busy pointing the telescopes to see what happens when a comet hits a planet. We hadn't seen one of those impacts before. But what the journalist told me was, apparently the Victorian Pigeon Fanciers Association was reporting that lots of their carrier pigeons, racing pigeons, were going missing in the month before the collision. And what they asked me was, is it true that magnetic waves from the collision will reach the Earth? Now, there's not really such thing as magnetic waves, but there are electromagnetic waves, and yes, we will see with our telescopes the flash from the explosions. So that's what I told them. The next day the headline was, "Astronomer says comet scrambles pigeon brains." So I'd made lots of mistakes. So let's talk a bit about how you can avoid these mistakes. So first of all, journalists who might want to talk to you about your research usually don't know much about science. Now, basically, none of the Australian newspapers have science writers who are actually experts who've worked for many years on science. I worked with some very good science writers in the Australian media, but they usually might have had a biology degree from 6 years ago, and they don't stay on the job for very long. One science writer I worked with at the Age newspaper got promoted to casino editor, because presumably the management thought that casinos were more important to Victoria's economy than science. So don't expect them to know very much about what's going on. They also don't have much time. The economics of newspapers are very poor at the moment. Journalists are being made redundant all the time, losing their jobs, and so the ones that are left have to work extremely hard and get many stories out in a day, so they don't have time to research what they're doing. Anything you can do to make it easier and quicker for them will be much appreciated. Now, this doesn't apply everywhere in the world. There are some newspapers around the world, and not really in Australia, who have expert, fantastic, deeply knowledgeable science editors. I'm thinking of papers like the New York Times or The Economist, but that's not the norm. TV news is even worse. TV news, at least in Australia, doesn't have researchers at all. They just have a journalist who generally know nothing about it. And they also have to produce many stories in a short amount of time, so don't expect any knowledge from the journalists. An important thing to keep in mind is that journalists work on an incredibly compressed timescale compared to scientists. You may have taken 5 years to do a research project that's learnt something, but when you go to the media, they will want an answer in the next 10 minutes or forget it. They've got deadlines to meet, they might have to go live at 3 p.m. on the radio, they need to get all the interviews lined up, and if you don't respond to their text message or phone message within the next 5 or 10 minutes, they'll just go and talk to somebody else or just ditch the entire story. So you have to work very fast. You can get everything prepared ahead of time, get your press release ready, decide what you're going to say, get the graphics ready, but once you send them out, it's going to be very, very fast. It might all be over in half a day or a day or so. So that's a shock to many scientists when they first deal with the media. Interview technique. This is something I've been trained in for media, and it goes against the grain for most scientists. Scientists tend to be honest people, with some exceptions, and we tend to have been trained in the idea that it's important to answer questions. So if a journalist asks you a question, you answer it. This is a mistake I made with the "Astronomer says comet scrambles pigeon brains." They asked me a question, is it true that magnetic waves from Jupiter will reach the Earth? And I answered it, well, yes. But the journalists didn't really know what they were talking about. The general public have this idea that either a signal reaches you, like you've got bars in your phone, or it doesn't. Whereas to a scientist, it's much more of course, electromagnetic waves will go across the entire universe. They just get so very weak. So what you've got to decide is, what's the message you want to give out? And no matter what the journalist asks, return to your message. Otherwise, you can go down a so-called rabbit hole. They will ask you a question that doesn't quite make sense, and you, being an honest scientist, will answer it, and that will then send them off on a new tangent, so they'll ask an even more strange question, which you will try your best to answer, and before you know what's happened, you're busy talking about something quite unrelated to the research you actually wanted to talk about. And believe me, I've made this mistake a few times. It might be talking about my particular research and end up talking about what happens if you fall into a black hole. All very interesting, but it wasn't what you're trying to cover. The thing to bear in mind is that when a journalist asks you a question, usually they're not actually after an answer. What they're just trying to do is get you talking. They want you to talk long enough so that they can get the quotes they need for their story. So they don't normally particularly care if you respond with something different, as long as you're giving interesting and juicy quotes and saying nice things, and that way you get to steer where the conversation goes. Now, I know this is often very annoying. You see politicians do this all the time. A journalist asks them a question and they go back to their talking point rather than answer it. But I think it's a bit different in the science case. When a political journalist often knows what they're talking about and they're deliberately trying to embarrass the politician, whereas a science journalist generally doesn't know the faintest idea what they're talking about, and all they're trying to do is get you talking so they can get their quotes. Once they've got a bunch of good quotes to fill in their story, they're happy, and it doesn't matter whether you answered their question or not. Normally, a media event will start with a press release. You have to decide when you want to put this out. There has to normally be a hook, like you're just about to publish the paper or have a press conference or something like this. And then you'll put out a press release to the media. You may give certain journalists first priority in return for exclusive coverage, but normally you just put it out to all the journalists. There'll usually be a media office that can do this for you. For example, the ANU has a very good media office, and so if you've got something newsworthy, you should talk to them. They can help you write your press release, and then when the time comes, for example, the day the paper is published, they will send it out to all the journalists, and you'll get all the coverage you want. Most companies also have a press office. Companies that don't, well, there are still often commercial organisations that will do this for you, so you can actually contract someone who has the list of journalists to send it out, if, for example, you're a small business and want to do this. It normally starts with a press release, which is a one-page sheet of paper explaining what the story is. And this is a crucial thing, and writing this correctly is a major part of what you should do. Journalists are usually insanely busy. In principle, you can give them information and they'll read it, think about it, interview lots of people and write their own story. But they don't have time to do that. They'll be much happier if they can more or less take your press release and use it as is, just putting a few of their own words and quotes in and maybe changing it here and there. That's the reality of how newspaper journalists work. And if you can give everything to them in a form that's suitable for them to use, it makes their effort much less and they're far more likely to cover your story. So press releases traditionally follow what's called the inverted pyramid style, as demonstrated here, which again is a somewhat alien style to many scientists. The idea is start with the most important thing. What's newsworthy? What's the hook? Why is it important now? Who did it? What did they do? When, where, why, how? And that should be in the first paragraph. So if a person in the public only reads the first paragraph, they've still got the gist of the story. And then as you go down, you report less important things. So the more important details in each paragraph goes on to tell you something less and less important. The basic idea is if somebody only reads the first 3 paragraphs, they're still getting some gist of the story. Also, from the newspaper point of view, the journalist will submit a story to the newspaper, say at 6 or 7 p.m. in the evening. The newspaper will go to print around midnight. But at that point, it'll be up to a sub-editor to decide how much of the story gets in. This will depend how much advertising they sell. Newspapers make their money by selling advertising. And so, let's say someone comes in with a big new advertising contract, they might decide they have to cut all the stories by 30% to make room for the adverts. So the journalist will never know how much of what they write is actually going to get in. And what the copy editors will do will cut things off the bottom. So you have to write your story so that if some copy editor at midnight decides to cut the bottom 2 paragraphs to make room for some more advertising, then it will still make sense. Strange, isn't it? Let's look at an example. Here's a bad example that I asked ChatGPT to write me. Here's a newspaper story, and this is written in chronological order, so it's explaining what you did, often the way you think about it. Well, we did this, and then we did that, then we discovered this, that was interesting, so we then went and did that. So you can read it at your leisure. I'll include it below the video. This one, if you just read the first paragraph, you don't know what they've done or why or how exciting it was or who did it or anything. Very bad. Here's the same thing written in inverted pyramid style. So it starts off with breakthrough in cancer treatment shows promising results in human trials. The title is really important. A new cancer treatment that combines immunotherapy with targeted drug delivery has shown promising results in early human trials, significantly reducing tumor size and improving survival rates. This is written by ChatGPT. I would probably have added in, say, scientists from the Australian National University or something like that. Name is important there, but because I asked ChatGPT to make it up, it didn't know the names. And then you pop up the key findings: effective tumour reduction, improved survival rates, and then you start putting the detail. This was started in 2021, we initially faced this challenge and so on. That might make it into the story, it might not, but nonetheless your key point is out there. This is also going to make it more interesting if someone is skimming through the newspaper or channel flipping through the TV news. It tells them right away this is interesting, what the exciting thing is, so they might then go and read the rest. Whereas if you go back to something like this, oh, yawn, what's going on here? I don't know, turn off, change channel, flip to the sports news. You don't always have to use this. There are other styles, but this is by far the most commonly used style used by journalists to write up their stories, and something you should use in your press release. Here, for example, is a press release I put out, quite a long time ago, nearly 30 years ago now. Some black holes are pink. A group of Australian astronomers have found that some black holes are bright pink. Then we say, black holes have covered the imagination of the public over the years in science fiction movies. Such intense gravity fields even suck in light. This is why they appear black. But people, mentioning names, have discovered that some black holes are pink. Then we say where it was discovered, which telescopes. Then we give them a quote, and then we give more details. This is classic inverted pyramid style. Get to the point really quickly. Why would the public be interested in this? Tell them who did it, why, when. Give them a nice quote, and then go into the details a bit further down. Now, we often think about media biases. This is often, is it biased towards the left wing or the right wing? But to my mind, for science coverage, that's not the most important bias. There are two really important biases you have to factor in. One is a bias towards news rather than olds. Like, I've lost track of the number of times there's been a newspaper story saying, new discovery casts doubt on the Big Bang Theory. If you believe the media, the Big Bang Theory would have been disproven 100 times. This is because explaining the Big Bang Theory, that's not new. It's not going to be in the news. It's the sort of thing that would be in a textbook, but what fraction of the public ever read an astronomy textbook? Whereas the number of people who watch the news is much higher. So most people never learn the old, well-established facts. All they get is the new results. And the new results are often a bit tentative, a bit uncertain, otherwise they wouldn't be new. And it tends to be the sensational results that get coverage. So new experiment confirms long-held beliefs about the Big Bang is not very sensational, whereas doubt cast on Big Bang, that will get the clicks. And the newspaper industry and the TV and blogs and things, they want clicks. That's how they make their money. Sensational story. I once published a result back in 2005. I was able to show that the odds of the Earth being hit by a comet, which has been in numerous movies, was actually about 10 times less than everybody thought. Put out a press release, zero interest. I think I got 2 radio interviews on ABC Radio National, and that was about it. Because comet's not as dangerous as you thought, it's not a news story, whereas comet might hit the Earth, that's a news story. That will get coverage all the way around the world. So generally speaking, the bad news and the unexpected always gets more coverage than the good news and the expected. Images get more coverage than spectra. So in astronomy, if you believe the media, you'd think it's all about pretty pictures. In fact, 70-80% of astronomy observations are spectroscopy. But how can you cover that in the media? By the time you've explained light is made of waves, you can split the waves out, you can do a graph which shows that some wavelengths have more light than others. This tells you about emission lines, so as atoms jump electron levels, you've lost them. That's too complicated. It's not very complicated, but it might take more than a minute, and a minute is all you're going to get. So 70-80% of what astronomers do cannot be explained in the media, and it's not because the media are biased, it's just because they only cover short stories. This is a really serious bias.